All right, welcome. Hi, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us tonight for our event with Sarah Manguso to celebrate her debut novel, Very Cold People. We're in for a treat tonight. She's in conversation with the one and only Heidi Julavits. My name is Evan Karp. I'm the events manager for Booksmith. We're an independent bookstore and mainstay of San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury district since 1976. Without further ado, I'm honored to introduce tonight's stars. Heidi Julavits is the author of 4 novels and 1 book of nonfiction. A co-founder of The Believer magazine. She edited the book Women in Clothes with Sheila Heti and Leanne Shapton. We had a beautiful event for that at the store. She teaches at Columbia University and seems to be writing only nonfiction these days. Most recently, pieces in the New York Times Magazine and the New Yorker about avalanches and volcanic eruptions, respectively. Next, she'll be writing about Magnetic North. Her upcoming book of nonfiction, scheduled for 2023, may or may not be told in the second person, but will certainly be delightful. That last part's mine. Sarah Manguso is the author of 8 books. Her previous book, 300 Arguments, a genre-defying work of aphoristic nonfiction, was named a Best Book of the Year by more than 20 publications. She's the recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship, a Hodder Fellowship, and the Rome Prize. Her work is regularly featured across the New York Times Magazine, the Oprah Magazine, and the New Yorker, among others. She grew up in Massachusetts and now lives in Los Angeles. As I mentioned, Very Cold People is her first novel. We are very excited to be hosting here tonight. Sarah, huge congratulations on the book, and Heidi, thank you so much for leading the conversation. I'm very excited to stop talking and turn it over to you two. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much, Evan. I'm thrilled to be in San Francisco tonight. Just kidding. I was just chatting with Evan and Heidi about how oddly worse, but also better it is to go on tour from my chair. It's wonderful to be here and for this finally to be a book. And I'm going to read to you from it, not for very long. I think it's about 7 or 8 minutes. But I'm just going to share a taste of the first chapter, and then Heidi Julavits will do what she does. All right. Very Cold People, chapter 1. My parents didn't belong in Waitsfield, but they moved there anyway. My mother answered the first knock at the door of the new house, expecting a casserole. We'd painted the house evening fog, she told me, but the woman from across the street wanted to know why we'd painted it purple like Italians. Some people wore their difference honestly, but my parents were liars, illegitimate Waitsfielders. Their off-whiteness discovered only after the paint had dried. By the time I was born, the house had faded to the color of dirty snow. The oldest houses in Waitsfield were older than the town and bore plaques to mark their age. Generations of families had been born and died in them, and the town's 6 graveyards were populated mostly by children. Over the centuries, the slate stones had eroded and sunk in the dirt, and they looked like gray, crooked teeth inscribed with little lambs and angels. On the way to school, I walked past a 300-year-old mustard yellow salt box that my mother admired for its leaded glass windows and historically correct paint color. It probably had all the right antique fixtures inside, big sooty hearths and Indian shutters, visible proof of connection to the first best people. My mother referred to Western Massachusetts as out west, and I was mostly ignorant of the geography beyond our neighborhood. 3/4 of the town stayed unknown to me, and that mystery drummed up a sense of scale. To this day, I couldn't tell you how to get to the lodge school where the rich kids went. It was just there somewhere in those 10 square miles, not for me to find. I often asked my mother to drive us down to the part of town where every house had a plaque. It looked like a movie set. I knew a girl whose house had been used in a television ad for a clothing store. The ad was shot in the spring, and the crew had sprayed the lawn and windowsills with sticky fake snow. At home, my mother cut out wedding announcements from the Courier, the only paper in town. Maybe the groom was a Cabot and the bride was an Emerson, and they sat on the boards of libraries and museums. My mother didn't know these people, but she liked the way they looked on our refrigerator. She also liked to study an old typeset record of the town's census, turning the well-handled pages as one would a beloved picture book. but there were no pictures, just lists of names and addresses. She cross-referenced the addresses with real estate listings in the Courier each week. Sometimes she took me to look at the big old houses. I never saw any people, just the houses, big Georgian colonials with widow's walks and little gabled windows like third eyes opening. I liked the estates too, especially on Pond Road, which my mother told me was the most expensive street in town. Pond was a dead end, so it took some persuading to get my mother to drive the length of it and turn the car around. But when I reminded her that we'd never seen another soul walking or even driving around there, she could be tempted. Those houses weren't old. They were just enormous and ornate, with statuary and foreign-made cars. A couple of them were always under construction and hidden under blue tarps. I recognized the difference between the houses that were the oldest and those that were merely the most expensive. I liked the old houses, and I swooned over the girls and boys at school with names like Verity and Cornelius. I knew that I could never build the kind of relationship with money that the people in those stately, drafty, oldest houses enjoyed. I didn't even bother trying to infiltrate them. I worshiped them from a distance. In our house, the old paint on the windowsill had its own sweet smell, different from the wall paint. I felt all around the window sash to find the draft, but there was none. The cold was just everywhere. After the monthly mortgage payment, my parents had almost nothing left over, and we had to be careful. For one thing, the bathtub had to be filled to the height of my hand and no higher. I pressed my fingertips into the bottom of the tub, not knowing where my hand ended and my wrist began. One summer, I found a green garden hose on the ground next to a neighbor's house. The hose had been left on. I tried to calculate the amount of water that had been wasted. What are we going to do? I asked the other kids. They didn't answer. Adrenaline spilled into my blood. Water poured into the muddy ground. An old Irish cable knit sweater, cardigan with leather buttons, hung in the downstairs coat closet, which smelled of hot farts and smoke. If anyone ever needed a sweater, they could go and put on the warming sweater, which was its name, as if other sweaters were merely decorative. My mother kept the house just cold enough for me to need to wear the warming sweater over my regular sweater, and she cut just enough plastic wrap to cover the diameter of a dish. I sat on the carpeted floor with my back against the radiator. It slowly bruised me, and if the heat came on, it turned my skin red in columns. A sheet of rigid plastic leaned between the radiator and the wall. It was meant to reflect heat back into the room. Autumn brought with it the slap clatter of crows, fire smells, leafy sweet rot, new corduroys, cold air, brown paper grocery bags folded over school books, writing on the first pages of notebooks, September 7th, September 8th, September 9th, never sure how my handwriting should look. We had 2 sugar maples in the backyard, and my mother liked them best because their leaves turned bright red, the farthest possible from their original green. One of the maples got sick, and she hired a man to cut it down. She said that the man had come and started cutting, and that she'd stopped watching him, and that when he came back to the house to get paid, she looked again and saw that he'd cut down both maples, dead and gone. She would mourn those red trees the rest of her life. When I walked home from school, I picked up leaves that were gold-specked crimson, green-edged vermilion, purple black. I picked everything up, pebbles and matchbooks and little things people dropped. In December, I picked up evergreen branches and taped them to my bedroom door and made decorations, a little Christmas garland just for me. One day, my mother emptied my jacket pockets and found 2 half-used matchbooks and screamed at me. I could have started a fire, but I wouldn't have wasted a match to start a mere fire. I'd found what someone else had thought was trash, so I took it. 1 inch of rain equals 10 inches of snow, we all knew, but that had to be approximate since there were so many different combinations of snow and ground. I remember the metallic smell of it in the air before it fell, the pale blue of it on a clear morning, the soft fuh of it falling, the powder of the coldest days, too cold to melt, squeaking at the boot, white, wet snow squeaking against my teeth, melting clear in the heat of my mouth. Snowfalls have unique bouquets. Snow isn't just frozen water. It carries a remnant of the sky. A blue hailstone tastes different from a white one because they've taken on air at different altitudes. We ate icicles not because they tasted good, but because they were a primal thing that could not be bought. To eat one was to dare someone to tell you it wasn't clean, that there was dirt in it, which we all knew. Everyone eats a peck of dirt in their life. And I'll stop there.
Amazing, Sarah. This is such an incredible book, and I'm so excited to talk to you about it, especially because I was looking back through my emails and I found the beginning of a conversation that we didn't end up having. It's from November 2019, and you'd come to New York to give a talk. And I went to hear your talk, and I believe you might have sold this book that day. Am I incorrect? Or you
sold it in 2020.
Okay, so you would.
But I don't know. Maybe I had a twinkle in my eye already.
You must have. But you talked about it, and you talked about basically that you were going to write a novel. And so I found the question that I wrote to you, which then we never got around to answering. And so now you can answer it.
Oh, yeah.
In front of
I think I know what the question is. Yeah.
Okay. So
my memory.
Yeah. Okay. So meanwhile, I'm dying to hear more about the following: the fictional versus the non-fictional impulse, and why your book is a novel. Like, why call anything anymore? But I do think there's a difference. I just can't articulate it. So I'm hoping you can.
And yeah, no, neither can I. I can't speak in general, but I can talk specifically about what happened that led to my writing a novel. And sorry, this scratching sound belongs to my cat. Okay. So some in the audience might know that I was a poet, and then I was a nonfiction writer, and published several short volumes of nonfiction, all autobiographical. And I always knew that I had a book about Massachusetts in me, and I refer to it in shorthand to myself and to others as the Boston book, knowing a few general qualities of this yet unwritten book. It would be sociological, it would be about race, it would be about whiteness, it would be about the cold, it would be about abuse, and it would be about the general muteness, blankness, and silence that covered everything when I was growing up in Massachusetts. And I was so thrilled that I persuaded you to participate in an event with me for this book, because knowing that you're from Maine, people in Massachusetts think of Northern New England as like way more hardcore. But it may well be that the sort of the caste system that was set in Massachusetts in the 1600s was really rather unmoved, untouched, and unchanged by the time I was growing up there in the 70s and 80s. So I knew that I had this book to deliver out of myself, to material I needed to exorcise, a story that I needed to tell in order to get it out of me. And every time I wrote it down, I was talking about this yesterday, and the problem with growing up in a community that runs on silence and muteness is that there's just not a lot of dialogue, but there's not a lot of content that I can report on. And as I tried to write the story of me in Massachusetts, I realized that so much of living there as a child, as in anyone's childhood, you take your default experience and you try to make sense of it. And so one of the skills that I developed as a child in Massachusetts was the skill at reading different kinds of silence, different kinds of muteness. Like I knew what was going on, but it was as if we were living in a very cold, slow pantomime. So the way that I was ultimately able to tell the whole story kind of counterintuitively involved making some of it up. And that is all I know about writing fiction, really. I just did it this one time, and I don't think I really
in one place, just in one place on one page.
Yeah, no, oh no, that's not what I mean at all. No, much of what is in the book, the protagonist Ruthie, she's really in charge of the story. It's not just me writing about my sticker collection, which I did have, and my writing about the geese sliding on the frozen pond, which I did see. There are very many, tiny set pieces, but they're mostly silent. Like there are no people in them.
Interesting. And so did you feel that it was, I mean, this is a weird question to ask, but like easier? Like, did you have an easy time of it? Or was it just like,
No.
maybe it's just like a project dependent,
Yeah, yes, definitely. Yeah, it's interesting now, when people recognize the difference between a novel and nonfiction, they, appropriately ask, wow, like, what was that big change like? But writing, my books of nonfiction don't really resemble each other. They're different lengths, they're different forms, they're, different subjects, everything about them seems kind of distinct from all the other books. And Very Cold People was just the next book, and it just has this one extra component that the previous books didn't have, which is that it's not autobiographical. And that I hear myself saying that, and I imagine being in the audience listening to a writer say that, and just thinking, no, it can't be that simple. It can't be that simple. But it really was. I as everyone does, I gathered everything that I'd learned from writing my previous books and used that. And then I had to just learn this next new thing. Yeah. I mean, is it like that when you write books? I mean, I know that you have like several novels. They're just very distinct from each other.
Yeah. I mean, it's a really interesting question. I think I am really interested in when things feel like they could be anything sometimes, and it almost feels like this bizarre afterthought where you're like, it's a novel or it's not a novel. Like my last book, people are like, you should call it a novel, and I don't know, I didn't want to.
Oh, The Folded Clock.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, there's a weird way that these things feel kind of like an impulse that you want to honor, like it is I don't know. I don't even know how to actually really talk about it without making even less sense than I am right now.
No, you're making perfect sense. I think the problem is that it's very tempting to try to say something general about fiction and nonfiction, when really the experience of writing a book is like just writing the one book. I remember a scientist said, do you remember when they first, when scientists were first able to take a human ear and graft it onto a mouse's back and have the mouse like grow the ear? I remember reading or hearing one of the scientists saying, now, nobody get too excited. We have not made it okay to just like grow back people. We grew one ear on one mouse. And I think about that all the time when I'm tempted to say something about let me say something about fiction. I have nothing to say about fiction. I have a few things to say about this one book that I wrote this one time.
I really want you to write a book about writing, any genre. Instead of that Anne Lamott Bird by Bird, I want it to be ear by mouse. Ear by mouse. Thank you. That's my request.
That's a very good idea.
Okay, so
and I'm not doing it.
Yeah, well, we'll see about that. I am curious, since you read this section, actually, it's on the first page. And you mentioned the caste system, which I think is really interesting when you're dealing with, well, you mentioned that I grew up in Maine. I actually looked up the census report from when I was a kid, and Maine was over 99% white when I don't.
Well, it still is the whitest state.
Yes, it is still the whitest state. But I want to get back to this, the narrator talking about this, let's say it's a caste distinction of off-whiteness. And I am interested in that, I think, in part because you're determining what somebody is by saying what they are not. That's how you're defining them. And so then that also sort of brings up questions of like what is understood as whiteness in this book. And yeah, I would love you to talk about that.
Yeah, no, I'm so curious to hear from people who actually grew up in New England. While working on this book, I read all sorts, back when it was still going to be a work of sociology, I read all of these fascinating books about who got to be white when in, the 18th, the 19th, and 20th centuries in New England. And you're exactly right that you are, upon arrival, defined by what you are not, which, if you're the newest wave of immigrant, is white. You are not white. So when the Irish arrived, they were not white. When the Irish arrived, in some areas, Black people had more rights than Irish people, and there's this terrible, it almost sounds like a fable, but like Irish were hired because enslaved Black people were too expensive if they died, but Irish people could just be like thrown into Boston Harbor, nobody would care. That's just one of many, many examples. Speaking from my own experience, I was born white in Massachusetts. My parents, members of the silent generation, born just before World War II, were kind of on the edge. My father was Italian. My mother was Jewish. They became white later in their lives. And just, none of this was articulated to me until really I was writing this book and just, read about what was what and who was considered what, like who got to be white when. I think it was Teddy Roosevelt who said that, from the sort of off-white areas of Eastern and Southern Europe, children in the third generation after immigration could be white. And that was just the rule. Like that's how you were counted in the census, which is insane. So I was the first person in my family to be born white. And there's something that happens to you when you cross that line in your lifetime. And there is a general, just a terror that it's going to be taken away again. And, I've gone on the record multiple times saying that Boston is the most racist city I've ever lived in. And I've lived in New York, LA, Iowa, Rome, San Francisco. And I think a lot of it is just that there are so many families who had these sort of, non-articulated but accepted crossings into white. And they probably felt that it just, did it really happen? I mean, everything is communicated by silences in Massachusetts. And is it similar in Maine? I mean, are these topics sort of dealt with verbally, or what was that like?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. I mean, I guess that what I was thinking about when you were writing about off-whiteness is that it seems that it can only exist in a dominantly white space.
Yeah. I mean, you create caste out of what is there. There were very few people of color.
And then how do you see the difference then, if there is one, between this like color distinction and class?
Yeah, I mean, that too felt extremely clearly codified, but was not communicated verbally. So even when I was very young, I felt this kind of, even though nobody sat me down and said, okay, there's certain people from certain families and they're better. And no, it was so much more insidious than that. But by the time I was 5 years old, I knew that the kindergarten friends with 3 names were just better, like, it was a sense. And, as an adult, in having now lived in cities where people talk a lot, it almost seems kind of fairy tale-ish or magical, the way that these truths were communicated to the children. But we all knew, and there was, did you ever use the term swamp Yankee in Maine? Okay, so
no, but Yeah, go ahead. No.
Yeah, no. So there's this boy named Whitaker who's a swamp Yankee, but I still knew that he was better because he had I won't say his last name, but he had the surname, even though he was dirty and went to school and wasn't well cared for.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, and even now I have trouble articulating exactly what who belonged where and why. But so much of trying to translate that onto the page was just an act of taking meaningful silences and meaningful blanks, meaningful omissions, and trying to translate them into language.
Okay, this leads to my next question very perfectly. So thank you for that segue. I am, without really just making a blanket statement about you, but like you are, in my mind, I think of you as being one of the strongest tools in your toolkit is omission, what you know not to write and what you write in order to activate all that negative space in your books. And I started to think a lot about, because of using the way that you use omission artistically and a way to gesture toward things that can't be said or are not being articulated, how that is different in your mind to silence, right? Like, what's the difference between omission and silence, especially when you're dealing with a community where there was those omissions were you weren't invited into them, and in fact it was like secrecy, and silence is also, oftentimes associated.
I love that you asked this question. You just reminded me that when I was visiting at Columbia, I taught a course on omission, on literary omission, and God, I had so much energy in those days. But I think I sorted the types of omission into 5 categories. But something that we talked about in that class was that there is a difference between omission and silence, and omission is a type of silence, but it's a meaningful silence. As you said, you place negative space on the page in order to frame the words, in order to create meaning. Whereas just the silent eternal blank, just of pure emptiness, that I think has to be something that's not in context, because nothing, wherever you place the silence, it's going to mean something. It's going to react to the so-called content that's around it. And I think that's what was going on in Massachusetts. And I wouldn't say anything so facile as that, growing up in Massachusetts made me the kind of writer that I am. I mean, certainly there were other ingredients that went into my long romance with white space on the page, but I don't think that there is such a thing as a silence in the context of non-silence that doesn't mean something.
The reason I was thinking about it also is because, sometimes silence or silencing maybe is different than silence, right? There can be a censorious element to silence, right? Or a feeling of sometimes it's power and sometimes it's powerlessness, right? But I was thinking too, how, this is a town where there are unspoken things, right? Maybe they're open secrets, but they are not talked about, right? And you were compared in one of the reviews of your book to Elena Ferrante. And I was thinking how, when I was reading this book, I was really thinking a lot about Stephen King.
Wow.
and I was wondering.
Elaborate.
Yes. Well, because I think almost all of his books start with this premise of like the town, and there's a secret under the town. And through this repression, like actual monsters spring up, And so anyways, I was wondering if you, and also just because you are dealing in a way in a kind of New England Gothic tradition. I think that's why King was coming to mind. And anyways, I'm just curious if any of that kind of horror speaks to you in some way.
It hadn't until this very moment, but it makes perfect sense. I think of King as a main author. Like do all of his horror novels take place in
do.
Maine?
They do.
Okay.
They do.
Yeah, I mean, it really does seem like they belong all in that one place. And, you know, we have like moralistic, we have Hawthorne, right?
Yes.
And so I hope it's not just me being tidily geographical, but I do feel that Very Cold People is more, you know, the great grandchild of Hawthorne than it is the grandchild or child of Stephen King. But I love the idea. You know, it's like, I don't know if you ever find yourself in this position after, you know, soon after you publish a book, before you really understand what you've done and what it is and what it means. I'm kind of marveling, thinking like, I never thought I would write like anything that could be described as horror, but I'm so thrilled by that now. And, you know, now I really want to do it. Like you know, what I'm working on now, could I put some undead pets in it, or?
But I think even if you don't, it's the sort of the same, it's a response to repression, right? It's the same kind of like tension. And in this case, I would argue plenty of really monstrous and horrible things happen, right? They're just not literally monsters.
Yeah, no, you're right, for sure.
I wonder why you keep sort of apologizing for being tidily geographic, as you said.
Oh, yeah. Well,
I mean, I'm curious about that because maybe I'm super tidily geographic as well, but I mean, I guess I'm curious to know how you think about place impacting character. Maybe you can talk about it for the sake of like creating a novel, or you could talk about it in terms of creating a human being who might be you.
In the context of my book and it being about Massachusetts, and, you know, my actual experience having been growing up in Massachusetts, you know, we thought of, I think Massachusetts folks think of Maine in the same way that Iowans think of Minnesotans. It's just like, you know, they know everything we do, but plus more, because it's colder. You know, it's like harder there.
So cold.
My mother is from Maine. I don't know if that has any relevance either. But no, I mean, part of why I was so thrilled that you would talk with me about this book is that, like, I kind of wanted to learn what you know, Massachusetts folks don't know, like, and what people in Maine do.
That's also a secret, and
of course, yeah.
I will repress all attempts to let it out.
I'll get you someday, Heidi.
I like that you equated cold with knowledge.
Yeah, it's right. Well, I mean, now I'm.
I mean, we do have to
tempted to generalize, but
we do have to talk about cold. We do have to talk about cold.
We have to talk about cold. Yeah, I mean, it's considered like a cool. Sorry, it's considered. Well, if you swim off the coast of Maine in like late August,
you'll get eaten by a shark.
That demands respect. But if you do it in September, it demands more respect. Mm-hmm. And it's like a thing people do to show off how much cold they can endure. Yeah. Isn't it? I mean, isn't that a thing?
Yes, it is a thing. It totally is a thing. But I think that I was thinking a lot about, well, first of all, I thought it was really interesting that you just equated cold with knowledge, so that in a sense, being able to endure cold somehow makes you a superior being.
Yes, absolutely.
But that is not how I was reading the way cold was being used in your book. How was cold? Or I should ask you, talk to me about cold.
Yeah.
And so like literal and metaphoric and all that stuff.
Yeah, of course. The cold that encompasses everything in the protagonist Ruthie's life is not a cold that she was able to choose. It was the cold of her geographic environment. It was the cold of her familial environment. It was the cold of her social environment. All of that was foisted upon her. And without giving too much away, the person who makes that, the accusation that is repeated in the title is somebody who is outside the immediate group of main characters who are kind of imprisoned in this town, Waitsfield, this imaginary town. It's somebody from the outside who says, "You're very, very cold people." And it's almost as if Ruthie can't really diagnose or examine or even disengage from the cold enough to even understand what it is, or that things are cold. But when this outsider does say that, it's kind of like it's the first moment at which Ruthie thinks, "Oh, yeah, that is a word that describes what I am in." And it also encourages me to think about the possibility that I might not always be in this, that I could perhaps leave. And that's the big change that happens in the book, I think.
Yeah.
So there's a cold, I don't think I really represented the kind of ostentatious, demonstrative endurance of cold. To some extent, Ruthie's parents do that a little bit because they don't need to use the heat. They don't need to wear sweaters. They don't need, they don't need to take warm baths. But Ruthie doesn't quite understand that. She can't possibly understand that because they are adults who know more about the world than she possibly could, especially at the beginning when she's only an elementary school student.
Yeah. I mean, the other thing that's really interesting to me about how cold functions possibly in, again, generalizing, in a New England environment, right? Is that on one level, right? Like you have to keep your heat low because you can't afford the heating bill, right? So your house is cold because you can't afford to pay for it.
But also you close all the doors and you only use 1/10 of your house. Yeah.
Yes. But then also there's, again, it's this complicated kind of code breaking that happens in places like that, where then you have this sort of, this Yankee thrift, this kind of, it's both kind of moralizing in terms of having to do without, but then also I feel like it's a little bit of it also can be a very upper class thing to do. We don't need heat,
Yes.
Anyways, I just think the way that cold functions is it's like a code that you need to break in a way. And I like that it also is you can measure it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
You're it's measurable. It's 55 degrees in your house or whatever.
Oh, I hope not.
Yeah. And then
I love everything you've just said. Yeah, it's measurable, it's social, it's it's internal, it's external, it's there's so much.
I mean, the other thing that's interesting about temperature too is that it makes me think of other books that you've written and other themes that have come up in your work, which is illness, and how temperature is also a way that bodily health
sign.
Yeah, it's a vital sign. It's the way health is measured, or failing health is measured, and yet there's also a way that you there are a lot of things. There are a lot of pains that can't be measured and a lot of suffering that can't be measured.
Oh, yes. This is slightly off topic, but just before we got on this call, I was reading really quickly through that Atlantic essay about friendship, but also about Rebecca Wolf and Elisa Albert's back and forth written conversation about friendship and about suffering, really. And have you read this piece yet?
No,
I haven't finished it, but it's fascinating. And a lot of the crux of what they argue about and what ultimately really threatens their friendship is that one of them believes that depression is just it's this irresistible force that is greater than us and always will be, and the other thinks that it's just a thing that it's like a story we tell ourselves about ourselves, and it's it's in your body and you can just get rid of it. And what you just said about the measurement of cold, the measurement of a vital sign, There's something so comforting about a thing that can be measured, even if the measurement itself is terrifying, like the planet getting warmer or the water level getting higher, or the case loads in every emergency room. There's this, even when the news was terrible, I just found myself clinging to the measurements that were reported in the news because it was a way of controlling it, containing it somehow.
Yeah. There's a really good question in the chat, but before I go to that, I want to ask you one more question here, and then we'll bounce over to the chat, and then we'll come back. Okay. Okay. In reality and in the culture, and I could say in your book, mothers absorb a lot of blame, and sometimes they deserve it. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the challenge of portraying motherhood in this book, or particularly this mother.
Oh, that's such a huge subject. That could have been the whole conversation. It is true that mothers absorb a lot of blame. Some things I've read about mothers in the past few days. Moira Donegan very astutely describes the social safety net of the United States as not existing because women have basically always just stepped in and been the safety net and done unpaid labor that holds capitalism together. I'm also always thinking about Kim Brooks's amazing book, Small Animals, in which she talks about the way that we moralistically judge mothers and fathers differently. So if you see, a father holding his own baby in a coffee shop, you think, oh, what a wonderful, attentive father. But if you see a woman in a grocery store with like 3 kids hanging off of her, trying to take a phone call and buy food all at the same time, you just think, oh, she's a mess. While of course always getting everything done. And I'm definitely aware that daughters are very judgmental of their mothers. And that was something that I wanted to portray in a way that wasn't like me talking about it sociologically, but to just kind of try to provide that lived feeling that Ruthie has. If you feel bad and the only person in your life or the main person in your life is your mother, you're going to blame your mother. There's so much data on when heterosexual parents divorce, historically the mother has been the one that sticks around to take care of the kids, but the kids blame the mother because even though, the dad disappears and shows up to take them to Disney World every 5 years, the mother always gets blamed and she absorbs all of that anger. That is just, that's something that I've learned, that I continue to learn more about. Even after writing this novel about a sort of an evil mother.
Yeah, I don't think she was evil.
No,
I didn't.
No, I mean, well, that's the big change. Yeah.
I had a lot of sympathy for her from the very start. I did. I know.
Oh, that's wonderful.
I did. I don't know if that means you failed.
No, not at all. I mean, one of the big projects of the book was trying to humanize its mother.
Interesting. Was it hard to humanize her?
No.
Okay.
No, I mean, by the end of it, I mean, it happens in a second. It happens so easily, I think. And it all has to do with the perspective of the daughter changing from looking at this, this immovable mass of human to, just perceiving her mother as just one human, not the human whose fault everything is.
Yeah. Okay, let's go to the chat, and I'm going to read you this question.
Okay, great.
This is from Samantha Shields. I love the sociological observations. I'd like to understand Sarah's take on the underlying, less obvious differences between the culture of Massachusetts versus California.
Oh, I don't know that they're less obvious. California is very different. Also, California is so big that the county that I live in, Los Angeles County, is it's bigger than Rhode Island. Is that right, Pebble? Excuse us. Something that question reminds me of is the tendency to look at the new world and to perceive, or the newer world, and to perceive it as not having any of the sociological problems that the old world does. So when I lived in the Northeast, I was having a conversation with a writer from the UK who said, America, one of the great things about America is that there's just no class system. Of course, I just laughed and said, "Oh, how little we know." And coming to California, it was tempting to say, there is such a class system here, but it's different from the one that I came up in Massachusetts, where everybody was white and there were gradations of whiteness. It's tempting to say that, all the white people are the same here, but it's not. There was I remember a couple of years ago in the New York Times, there was this long essay about, it might have been in the magazine, a long essay about how in Hawaii, so many different people of so many different races and so many different types of biracialness and multiracialness coexist in this island paradise. And I had spent some time in Hawaii at the time. I was married to somebody who had grown up in Hawaii. And a couple of people said to me, that really does seem amazing. I mean, isn't Hawaii amazing? And I said, well, did you read the comments? Because those are people from Hawaii talking about how incredibly racist Hawaii is. But, as an outsider, you don't see it. You don't see really anything real. It's just your projection of what you think might be better than where you're coming from.
Okay, we have a question from Sheila Heidi.
Oh,
is a novel received differently from the sorts of books she wrote before? I guess you are the she, Sarah, and this particular Ear on Mouse novel.
Oh, I love this question. Well, my book came out yesterday, so it's been a minute. More will be revealed, as they say in AA. And I will say that this is kind of an answer to an adjacent question, but I'm going to say it anyway. When I published my first prose book in 2008, which was a memoir, it was nonfiction, it was autobiographical, I remember thinking at the time that there were several male critics whose endorsement I really wanted, I really yearned for. I envied when I saw other writers get those endorsements. And I've realized now that on the publication of this book, all of the criticism, and there have been some exquisitely observed and reasoned essays written about this book that I will never get over my excitement and gratitude for. They're all written by women, and I realize I don't have this feeling of I want the endorsement of the man or the men or even specific men. I just think, oh, something is different. Something is definitely different now. And I don't think Sheila would mind my sharing that, she and I have, her amazing novel, Pure Color, is coming out in a week or two. And she and I have kind of been, checking each other back and forth and reading each other's criticism. And, there have been some great essays published about her book too. And, Sheila said something really smart the other day about how, it may be that finally we aren't just all looking to daddy to give us the endorsement we need to feel, like we're good enough. And as I said, that was not the answer to the question that Sheila asked.
No, well, I'm really curious to know, what changed? Was it you who changed? Was it the culture that changed?
Yeah, both maybe, or not both. I don't know. I'm tempted to say it's something about the culture that's changed, but certainly, yes, I've gotten older, and you're treated differently in the press when you're 32 versus 47.
How are you treated differently?
Well, I think I didn't burst on the scene with one, my first. my first book, like nobody knew about my first, nobody knew. My career has been gradually built. I think that at this age, I am now, I think, afforded a kind of seriousness or respect that like an older lady receives.
Do you think there's a window? I think there's a window though, right?
Oh
Because then
God,
you
I don't
become
know.
right.
Well, the thing is, like, I mean,
know.
like, as we're aging, the culture is also aging. So there's no like there's no hard and fast rule. But yeah,
You're in the sweet spot. You're in the sweet spot.
yeah. Come on, baby. Get those good reviews.
Okay. Well, I think that is there anything else you would like to speak of before we go?
Speak of,
Is there something we didn't talk about?
oh, there's
It's funny.
so much
I did want to know about temperature being gendered. You know?
Oh, say more about that.
Well, I mean, I was sort of curious about how, in the same way, this maybe connects to what you were saying earlier about when you see like, you know, a man with a child and you're like, what an amazing parent. And then you see this woman and she seems like she's a mess and worthy of judgment, you know? In the same way, I was thinking about how cold I don't feel like it's often applied to men in the same way that it's applied to women.
Yeah, no, it's true. Women are cold. Men are leaders. Or I can't remember whether it's Barbara Streisand or Gloria Steinem. Somebody a long time ago really set it up very succinctly. It's like, you know, women are cold, men are leaders. You know, women are slutty, men are authoritative. You know, it's just like every personal quality. No matter what it is, if it's a woman's quality, it's perceived as negative. If it's a man's quality, it's perceived as positive. And yeah, no, I would never. It's like calling a man quirky. Like maybe if he's like queer, he could be described as quirky. But God, yeah, no. There are so many young women artists who are just written off as quirky, as if like that's a nice thing to say, or whip smart, which is something you should only use to describe a child, and even then it's a very bizarre judgment, I think.
Okay, anything else that you should we talk about? What did you keep your thermostat at? What was your family's thermostat kept at? I'm just curious.
62 at night.
62. Okay,
yeah,
so
what was yours?
It was 55.
Fuck. See, I told you Maine was more hardcore. I will tell you that it does get cold at night in LA. It is a desert. And one of the things that I have invested in is that I'm going to keep my house as warm as I want all night long. And every night that I wake up in the middle of the night and I'm not cold, I feel grateful.
Yes. You've arrived. You've arrived.
I've arrived.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you so much.
Heidi, I can't thank you
to talk
enough.
about. No, thank you.
I never want this to end.
Fascinating. Anyways, congratulations again on your beautiful book. And I hope everybody reads it. And I also encourage everyone to read all of the criticism about it, which has also been fantastic and so deserved and so smart. So whip smart, all of it. Okay. I guess we're going to turn it over to Evan.
Hi, I don't have anything to add. Just thank you to both of you.
All right. Yeah. Can I be the last to say thank you? This is such an incredible gift. Thank Heidi. That was one of the great conversations of my life. Thanks to everyone who showed up, even though I can't see you and don't know how many you are, but I feel your eyeballs and your love. And thanks, Evan. Thanks, Booksmith. And may we all meet again in person before long.
Yes, please, please.
Get the book, people.
Bye, Sarah. Bye, Evan. Thank you.
Bye, everybody.